On March 18, 2011, a doors-off sightseeing helicopter lost engine power above New York City. The pilot had to make a quick decision on where to attempt an emergency landing. He opted to avoid crowds by landing in the East River, but a malfunction in the helicopter's emergency flotation system caused it to flip upside down in the frigid water. The pilot managed to escape, but the 5 passengers aboard were tethered to the helicopter. This system that kept them safe from falling out of the open doors during flight would prevent them from escaping the submerged vessel. All 5 passengers drowned. FlyNION is a company that offers sightseeing helicopter rides over New York City. When you book a reservation, you have the choice between a flight with the doors on or the doors off. In a doors-off flight, adventurous passengers can feel the wind in their faces and even stick their legs out over the city. FlyNION has an impressive social media presence, and a popular souvenir from these flights is the shoe selfie, which is an aerial shot of the passenger's legs and shoes above one of the city's landmarks, such as the Manhattan skyline, Statue of Liberty, Central Park, or the Brooklyn Bridge. To keep the passengers safe from falling out of the helicopter during one of these doors-off flights, FlyNION created a tether system. Each passenger was fitted with a full-body harness that was then tethered at the back to an anchor within the helicopter's cabin. Passengers would wear this harness underneath the helicopter's standard seat restraints. At particular portions of the flight, the pilot would communicate to the passengers that they could exit their seats and hang their legs off the sides of the helicopter. The passengers were then free to open the standard helicopter seat restraints, but they would remain anchored to the cabin within FlyNION's harness system to prevent them from accidentally falling out. On March 18, 2011, 5 people were scheduled to participate in one of FlyNION's doors-off helicopter sightseeing tours of New York City. They arrived in the early evening at the company's facility in Kearny, New Jersey for pre-flight information and a safety briefing. In this safety briefing, the passengers were equipped with FlyNION's harness and tether system. It resembled a workplace fall protection harness with connected shoulder, leg, and chest straps. In the back, a dorsal ring connected the passengers to an anchor in the middle of the cabin via a tether. The passengers needed help to put the harness on and take it off, but they were provided with cutting tools that they could use to free themselves from the harness in the case of an emergency. At around 6:50 p.m., the 5 passengers and their pilot boarded the helicopter for what was intended to be a brief 30-minute flight. The helicopter they were aboard was a Eurocopter AS-350. Powered by a single engine, it has room for 5 passengers in addition to the pilot. This was a full flight. 4 of the passengers sat in a row behind the pilot, and 1 of the passengers sat next to the pilot, in front of the controls. Their first destination was the Statue of Liberty. They arrived around 7 p.m., and the pilot notified the passengers that they were free to remove their standard seat restraints and could turn to stick their legs out of the helicopter. The 2 passengers that were seated in the back middle could move to sit on the cabin floor at the open doors. After taking pictures near the Statue of Liberty, they continued north up the East River. The passenger that was seated in the front next to the pilot was taking shoe selfies. He was reclining his body so that he could take pictures of his legs extended out over the city. In between selfies, he would sit back up in his seat. As he moved around, the tether attached to the back of his harness dragged across the helicopter's floor-mounted controls. At 7:06 and 8 seconds, the front passenger again sat up in his seat after taking a shoe selfie, but this time his tether caught on one of the floor-mounted controls. It pulled on the fuel shutoff lever. He had accidentally and unknowingly cut off fuel flow to the helicopter's sole engine. Within 2 seconds, the engine lost power and the helicopter began losing altitude. The pilot needed to act fast, and he didn't know that the fuel shutoff lever had been pulled. All he knew was that the engine had suddenly lost power. When a helicopter loses power, it doesn't just fall out of the sky. It can auto-rotate, which means that the rotor blades continue to be driven by the upward flow of air through them, rather than by an engine. It's similar to how a maple tree seed falls through the air. It spins and slowly falls to the ground even though there is no engine powering it. The spinning of the rotor is only powered by the force of the air passing through. For a helicopter, it means that you have a chance to avoid a catastrophic hard landing if you act fast and quickly find an appropriate landing spot. The pilot only had seconds to figure out what was going on and then make a decision on where to attempt an emergency landing. He yelled for the passengers to get back into their seats and buckle into their standard seat restraints. The helicopter had been making its way towards Central Park, but the pilot could see that it was crowded, and he didn't want to hurt anybody below by suddenly landing amongst the crowds. So, he opted to land in the East River. In theory, this wasn't a bad idea. The helicopter was equipped with an emergency float system which would allow them to float on the surface of the river and await rescue. When the helicopter was only a few hundred feet above the water, the pilot reached down to pull the fuel shutoff lever. He needed to cut off fuel to the engine to reduce the risk of fire in a hard landing. That's when he realized the lever had already been pulled. He quickly realized what had happened to cause the engine failure. He slammed the fuel shutoff valve back down, allowing fuel to flow again, and fired the engine back up. But it was too late. He didn't have enough time to recover the helicopter. At 7:06 and 58 seconds, the pilot made a mayday call and deployed the emergency float system. They landed in the East River at 7:07 and 15 seconds. It had only been 1 minute and 13 seconds since the front passenger's tether had caught the fuel shutoff valve. However, their ordeal was not over. It was about to get much worse. The emergency float system had failed to deploy properly. The floats on the left side of the helicopter had inflated just fine, but the floats on the right side were only partially inflated and could not support the weight of the helicopter. Upon landing in the river, the helicopter immediately began rolling onto its right side. Within 4 seconds, the rotor blades began striking the water. 7 seconds later, the helicopter had completely inverted. It was upside down under the water. Water rushed into the cabin. It was cold, only 4 degrees Celsius, and visibility was less than 1 foot. The pilot was able to release his own restraint since he was only wearing the standard seat restraints and not the additional tether harness. He tried to help the front passenger escape, but he was quickly overwhelmed by the rush of water. He escaped the submerged helicopter and was picked up by a nearby tugboat that had watched the incident unfold. Emergency responders from the police department and fire department were on their way, but rescue divers weren't able to enter the water until 7:25 p.m. None of the passengers had been able to escape their restraints. They were trapped upside down in the submerged helicopter for nearly 20 minutes. They all drowned. The 5 passengers who lost their lives were Trevor Cadigan, Brian McDaniel, Carla Vallejos Blanco, Daniel Thompson, and Tristan Hill. In their investigation of the incident, the NTSB identified several contributing factors to the disaster. The primary one was the passenger harness system, which allowed the front passenger to inadvertently pull the fuel shutoff lever, causing the helicopter to suddenly lose power, and then prevented the passengers from escaping the submerged vessel. Another factor was the failure of the emergency flotation system to keep the helicopter upright on the water. The NTSB report also cites FlyNION's deficient safety management by failing to foresee that the front passenger's tether could interact with the helicopter's controls and that the passengers would have difficulty escaping their harnesses in an emergency situation. Ultimately, the NTSB deemed the landing survivable, even with the failure of the emergency flotation system. It was the FlyNION provided harness system that prevented the passengers from egressing that cost them their lives. As a result of the incident, the FAA banned doors-off flights using passenger restraints that cannot be released quickly in an emergency. Today, FlyNION still offers doors-off flights over New York City. Now, they fly in a different helicopter, a Bell 206 Long Ranger, which doesn't have the same fuel lever vulnerability, and they've redesigned their harness system to include a quick release. This is a really tragic case. It's also frustrating because to me it doesn't seem like there was gross negligence or terrible recklessness by anybody involved. The pilot seems responsible and acted quickly and competently to the best of his ability. FlyNION seems to take safety seriously, as they had plans in place to protect passengers from the dangers of the open doors and even had contingencies in place for an emergency in water. The helicopter was equipped with the emergency flotation system, and the passengers had cutting tools to escape their harnesses and a brief training before the flight on what they should do in an emergency. On paper, it seems like a fair plan, but as we saw in practice, that's not how it went. The training the passengers received was not sufficient for them to handle the situation, especially when they were suddenly flipped upside down and submerged in dark, frigid water. It's easy to look at cases like this in hindsight and say what they should have done differently. But in this one, it seems like the company and the pilot each made a genuine good faith attempt to keep the passengers safe. They just failed. They definitely needed to make the restraints easier to escape, and they probably shouldn't have a passenger in the front where they could accidentally interact with the helicopter's controls. If there's going to be a passenger in the front, maybe they should remain forward facing in their seat like the pilot, rather than being free to turn and allow their tether to drag across the controls. I'm really unsure how to feel about this one. It seems like it was truly just a heartbreaking accident. If you agree, or if you have a different opinion, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. Please check out some of my other videos on aviation and marine accidents, and subscribe to my channel so you'll be notified when I upload again. Thank you.